Hi everyone, my name is Alex, and today I will be presenting on the massacre of 1932 in Cuscatlan, or colonially called El Salvador. I will start with a historical background. What is now known as El Salvador was originally named Cuscatlan in the Nahuatl language, translating into the land of precious jewels. After 440 years of colonial invasion, in 1932, wealthy Criollos, whites born in Semanahuac, or sometimes known as the Americas, Western Hemisphere, European landowners continued the enslavement of our people and acted as feudal lords, in other ways those who have authority over others. With the colonization of Cuscatlan, the Europeans broke our people's social structure, drastically changing it, as we were no longer allowed to use our traditional land holdings. The colonizers viewed communal landholding as an unproductive way of living, because it did not allow for anyone to own individualized private property. This is a European concept. In the 1880s, the Criollo-dominated government of what is now called El Salvador passed a series of land tenure laws that would abolish the ejido system, communal land holdings, and it encouraged coffee cultivation by large landowners. Also, the law which protected communal indigenous lands and thus favored land ownership by poor people was changed by the government. This allowed for huge concentrations of land to be transferred over to a few elite families, and by the end of the century, our people had remained landless. As a result, the economic domination of wealthy criollos, known as the 14 families, owned over 90% of all the money, power, and land, putting our Nican Tlaca indigenous people without anything. This, of course, was greatly supported by the Criollo-dominated government. The landowners grew cash crops, deforesting the land and causing permanent change in the environment and climate. Wage labor came into use, and it created a semi-feudal system where the landowners paid wages in scrip, which could only be used at the plantation store. When I reference the term Nican Tlaca, we must understand it to be a collective term. It is what our ancestors used to distinguish themselves from the Europeans during the beginnings of the invasion of Anahuac. In the Nahuatl language, it literally means we the people here. It was a divisionary term towards the Europeans to signal them out as invaders. With the massacre of 1932, prior to that was the crisis of 1929 and the impact of coffee exportation. Prior to the economic collapse with the coffee boom spreading rapidly, the Criollo ruling class aligned themselves with European foreign capital, condemned to exploitation and misery our indigenous people. The Great Depression of 1929 devastated Cuscatlan's economy, at the time totally dependent on coffee. Thus basic salaries were reduced to a minimum. With the collapse of the stock market in New York, which lasted approximately 5 years, those regions controlled by the so-called industrialized nations, often said to be first world countries, became more impoverished and marginalized. The price of the coffee dropped, as was the demand for it, Cuscatlan being one of the major attributors to coffee exports. 90% of its GDP at the time was coffee. As a result, the prices were so low that many coffee farmers decided that it was not worth harvesting the grain and did not hire cutters. These cutters were our own people. The downward spiral seemed uncontrollable. There was unemployment and bankruptcy. Nican Tlaca pre-uprising. As a result, discontent came to head in the Sonsonate region, where the foundation of a well-conducted indigenous uprising began. Our brothers and sisters in Cuscatlan began to organize a popular movement of large thrust, where they were able to gather 75,000 members, the main goal being to fight for our lands and demand higher wages. For our Nican Tlaca people, this was a way of survival as an independent political entity within the European nation state. In each region, there began to be alliances in order to form against the high rents of land and demand a law expropriation that would rid them of debt. The the violation of their rights as founders of the nation, and the continued injustice and impunity of the armed forces and government officials, which were of Spanish descent, seeking to extract the lands of our people in order to negotiate a way of placing large monetary funds in European banks for themselves. With the European invasion, our people have been subjected to Criollo European ruling. Thus, our lands have been appropriated and exploited for their profit and their interest, not ours. This system of appropriation continues today, where most of our people must pay rent to live on their own lands, where they are segregated in the filthiest slums and placed in chronic poverty conditions. This was no different in 1932. At the time of the uprising, what was known as the 14 families, as mentioned earlier, controlled much of Cuscatlan. These families were of European descent, coming from Germany, France, Spain, and England. They lived in splendor of kings, surrounded by servants, sent their children to be educated in Europe or the US, and waste money on other cravings. The rest of the population has virtually nothing. Eric Ching. Under this colonial invasion, time became an enemy to our people, and they felt the need to act fast. Thus, in January 22 of 1932, they took arms and went out in defense of their lands. The uprising begins. It is a greater crime to kill an ant than a man, for when a man dies, he becomes reincarnated, while an ant dies forever, said Maximiliano Hernandez. This was in reference to our Nican Tlaca people, as he believed that our people had no humanity, that if they were to be killed, they would be reborn, so it didn't matter how many were killed at the time. During the period of dictator Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez, in January 22 of 1932, the people of Tacuba, Huayúa, Sonsonate, Santa Ana, Izalco, Cuiznahuat, Santo Domingo de Guzman, Nahuizalco, Salcuatitan, took off in the battlefield directly facing troops of the armed forces. The movement lasted more than 4 days. Our people rose up in rebellion, armed mostly with machetes and a few guns. They attacked military garrisons, occupied towns, looted and destroyed businesses, government buildings, and private homes. And they struck out against the agrarian elite, wealthy business owners, and municipal leaders who won their offices in corrupt elections. With anger in their faces, many of the richest individuals in these communities were killed. The principal aims of the insurgents were the reclamation of civic power and the redistribution of food and material goods to their own, the indigenous people of Cuscatlan, Julio Cesar Calderon. During this same time, there were ethnic rivalries between the population who had been assimilated into whiteness and now identified as mestizo, and Nican Tlaca. This intensified, thus leading to the loyal support of even our own people to consider killing their own, the one who identified as indigenous. The Salvadoran government used the media to dehumanize our indigenous population. They portrayed our people as infuriated savages and virus-infested, and called our resistance a moral sickness. Rafael Lara Martinez. There was also a mestizo landowner who identified as European from the town of Huayúa, who during the 1932 uprising wrote in his diary, "The Salvadoran government did the right thing, exterminating Indians before they could impede the progress of the nation." This here is a vital insight of the mindset Europeans implanted in our minds, the exclusion factor of self-hate. I am mixed, hence I am not one of them, I am one of you, I am European. However, this was controlled by the armed forces with the cooperation of landowners who also participated in the massacres of our indigenous people in different parts of the West. These began capturing people involved in the indigenous insurrection and started persecuting, torturing, and killing anyone who dressed, had physical traits, and spoke our indigenous languages. It is estimated that the number of deaths out of 1.5 million who identified as indigenous came close to half of the Nican Tlaca population to be murdered. One major act of genocide was that of indigenous leader and chief of Izalco, Jose Feliciano Ama, where local authorities got hold of the remaining Nican Tlaca population that was part of the uprising and began to murder them in groups. As for Ama being the most respected of the region, he was arrested by the armed forces and landowners re-invaded the city of Izalco. Our Nican Tlaca people were lynched by a group of landowners, members of the armed forces and members of the Martinez dictatorship, calling for revenge and beaten to death. Ama was hung and his body was dragged along the roads as a way to instill fear to the rest of our people. His head was decapitated and placed in display at Izalco's Plaza, where our elementary children were forced to go to see what would happen to them if they ever decided to go against the Criollo government. It is estimated that 40 to 50,000 of our people were killed, one of the biggest genocides in the history of Cuscatlan that is never talked about. Many of them were women and children. As a result of the massacre, there were many sequels of colonialism and historical identity trauma. After putting down the uprising, the sold-out government of Martinez Hernandez began a process of repression against those who still opposed and who had lived to see the aftermath of what was one of the biggest genocidal acts on our continent. First, all classic indigenous attire was abolished, which is now almost non-visible in Cuscatlan. This was a way to Europeanize the way we dressed and be able to classify our people with the terms such as mestizo, a colonial rape term used to dilute any ties to our indigenous heritage, history, and or culture. With our vestment being taken away, the Criollo government changed the census as to include all of our people as part of a mestizo nation. This was a way to signal out its racism and hate for he or she who was of indigenous descent, ultimately gaining control of our lands, labor, and resources. Consequently, it also brought to an almost complete extinction the Nahuatl-speaking population, which as a result has been an effect of the loss of one of the biggest original indigenous languages in Cuscatlan. Indigenous people abandoned many of their traditions and customs for fear of being caught and avoid being victims of conflict. With the passing of years, our indigenous people were said to have disappeared, to be in the 21st century in a state of near extinction. Hence, in the decade following the consequences of the uprising, the military presence in the area was persistent in order to keep everyone under control to avoid repetition of the events. This meant controlling their minds. It meant physically threatening them and strictly enforcing laws. You are no longer to be an Indio, but a regular campesino or mestizo, Maximiliano said. With this, as I mentioned earlier, the concept of mestizaje came more into being. Today, virtually all of our people who are categorized as mestizos live in zones where European colonialism has been most active for the past 521 years. With the aftermath of the massacre, the use of the word mestizo became widely enforced by the government in Cuscatlan. This further served colonialism's plan to liquidate us. This, however, is applicable to all of us in our current conditions. After the massacre, the government began to seem to speak of our indigenous people as non-existent. Somos una gente libre de indios, said Maximiliano Hernandez. People categorized as mestizo tend to have several characteristics in common. They reside in areas subjected to recent European colonialism and its offshoot imperialism, meaning that we as a people seldom possess the power or resources to determine our own destiny, either political or intellectual or even psychological. Our existence has been predetermined as a direct byproduct of European colonial policy. Jack Forbes. Therefore, after the massacre of 1932, Cuscatlan became a made-up mestizo nation, who had no clear ethnic affiliation, a clear proof that our genocide as Nican Tlaca is an ongoing process. According to Casey Williams, 94% of Cuscatlan is now considered mestizo. But once again, this 94% that he speaks about are people with indigenous descent, mixed with raped European blood, meaning that whether some of the population may have a notion of being indigenous, while some might ignore it, it comes down that we collectively have an indigenous background. With this in mind, the colonial system that dominates us and has us in a state of slavery seems to have decided that we as Nican Tlaca are programmed to disappear. But of course, this disappearance is completely imaginary and exists only in the minds of Europeans. For one, the concept of becoming integrated into this European forced identity of mestizaje was a technique to create wars within ourselves, not only physical, but internally. Secondly, mestizaje was a way to forcibly destroy our ethnic identity and culture in programs of de-indigenization. In other words, not indigenous anymore. As of now, 75% of the population in Cuscatlan is Catholic. With the genocide of 1932, we see how the Roman Catholic Church once again becomes the epitome of destruction against our people by hiding their intentions of indoctrination as a way to respond to the hardships, uprisings, and repressions of this period. Therefore, from this point on, the Catholic Church takes advantage of this mestizaje, which is clearly an institution of mental slavery for our Nican Tlaca people, targeting rural communities, the communities that our people have been placed in for 521 years, and started organizing things such as Bible group studies and used their method of appealing by speaking about earthly, social, and political, economical reasons as to why we were in chronic poverty conditions. Mestizaje was a way to make the Nican Tlaca way of life a bad thing and encourage via racism our people to try to become Spanish, white, or at least via mestizo. Finally, it discouraged the association of any mixed race bloods with people who still identified as indigenous, developing a shame and self-hate for their own. With this, those Criollos and Europeans who were and still continue to rule our land made everything possible to be sure that all our people were of mixed ancestry, whether of mixed ancestry or full-blood ancestry, started to regard everything European as good and civilized, and everything indigenous as bad, uncivilized, or at best rustic. With the 1932 massacre, there comes what I call a memory loss, a traumatic post-syndrome. Our people from Cuscatlan began to experience a detrimental memory loss of ongoing repression by the colonial powers. Over the years, we have had several people from Cuscatlan. About half of them looked full-blood Nican Tlaca. They inferred mestizo identity upon themselves and seeing their family. It was obvious that they weren't mixed. I see that as a part of the new tradition of identity for our people from Cuscatlan. There seems to be more trauma coming from Cuscatlan because of this recent genocide, determining our people's silence in relation to these acts of terrorism. Even today, this fear of being indigenous, of acknowledging your presence in this world as a people of this continent is something taboo. Being Nican Tlaca not only has been constructed as an identity of the past, but also an identity that carries a load of racism and a corrupt subjugation to the Europeans who rule our lives and have kept us in a state of slavery and blindness, ignorance at its very best. The role of our historical memory as a method for liberation is one that as Nican Tlaca we have been systematically denied, or best yet have been distorted by European-infested garbage. In other words, a history that makes us self-hate, to see each other as our enemy and see our ancestors as something of the past, as something that is no longer present or alive. Thus, our minds are programmed with the idea of having white saviors, of becoming friends with the real enemy, and seeing our collective struggle as a colonized people as something to be dealt with without action, without any proper study, but to accommodate to it and forgive all the hate of the years of servitude to European enslavement. Lastly, we have constructed a colonial identity and a state of mind. Let us take a moment to reflect on what psychological traumas massacres like this have caused on our people. Why is it that today almost all of Cuscatlan will deny their indigenous heritage, and how have they taken on colonial identities as their own? When I refer to colonial identity, I refer to the current state that we are in. We are a people who have been made to feel inferior, a people who do not know its true origins and who identify with the terms of the white man. These terms include Hispanic, Latino, Mestizo, and Raza Cósmica. The word Hispanic in brief means he who descends from Spain. We are clearly not Spaniards. Latino, that of Southern European. We are not Southern European. Mestizo, a mix of bloodlines. It was no mix, but a rape, and as a people, many of us possess the scars of such rape. We are in no way to identify with the colonizer and take pride in such a genocide. Whether we are mixed or full blood, this does not take away from us our right to claim who we really are, the people of Semanahuac. Raza Cósmica, coined by José Vasconcelos, to define who we are in terms of what he referred to as a fifth race. We are not a foreign people. We were here before the invasion. We continue to be here, and we will still be here. We have an identity. We are not something new. We are Nican Tlaca. Hence, this colonial situation has manufactured us, the colonized, into something foreign to one another, to seeing each other as enemies, a people divided and not connected as one. We as Nican Tlaca indigenous people of this continent, both geographically and culturally, have been torn apart from our real history and given a history that shows us to be people of savagery, people of no morals, a people destined to be slaves. The key to decolonization is what I call a conscious act of cultural revitalization. There needs to be a rebirth of our cultures that were dismantled during colonialism. But in order to do this, we must do proper study and become warriors for our people instead of the cowards we are trained to be. We must rid of the Eurocentric power structure way of thinking, but to teach our people about their genius ancestry. With the understanding of political, economic, and cultural knowledge of who we are, we can break free from white supremacy, have a collective understanding, and be in solidarity with one another. With our knowledge and by keeping this knowledge alive, we will offer us as a Nican Tlaca people a way out of the enslavement and poverty, both economically, socially, politically, and psychologically, that we face today. It is a starting point to destroying the structure established by colonial ideologies and creating a society based on Nican Tlaca liberation. Before I conclude, I will read to you a brief poem. We are Nican Tlaca, we are alive. They'll have to kill us first, that should be a given. They'll have to take us, each one of us, clamp our wet mouths shut with their star-grinned hand full of lies. They'll have to kill us, but they never will. We are here, we are alive. We are Nican Tlaca, the indigenous people of Semanahuac. We are the ones left to give truth to who we are. Thank you.